being born and brought up in England, one doesn't appreciate the fact that one's English. When one goes to a foreign country, then of course it becomes very clear that you're different and you realize you are English. That's a trivial thing to say, but it's something that came as a great shock to me when I moved to France in 1977. However, it gives me a great pleasure, Alan and Fabian, to invite you to give your talk about the peculiarity of the English, and I shall try and reconnect so that I can hear you. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much for your introduction. So I'll just say two or three words, and then we'll move into a PowerPoint. So you'll stop seeing me anyway shortly. This talk is divided into two parts. The first part is about how I came to discover some of the peculiarities of the English. And the second part is about one or two of the peculiarities I discovered. Starts with a famous quotation from Rudyard Kipling, The English Flag. And what should they know of England, who only England know? Which is what we just heard about. The Confucian saying, a fish would never discover water or a bird discover air, summarizes it. If you're in a culture all your life, you don't notice it, you just swim or fly in it. So I had to have a number of shocks through my life, which first taught me what the English are and then distanced me from them. I needed a sense of wonder and surprise at the oddness of the English. So if we could move to the PowerPoint, Tony. Right, so here we have the talk. It's going to be very hurried in 30 minutes. So if you want to follow up any of the things I talk about, I have a pretty full website, which is there, and also a lot of films on my YouTube channel, Ayabaya. So have a look at the website, and particularly under life, you'll find the 9 volumes of my autobiography are there under life as free download PDFs, if you're interested in that aspect. And there are other books as well. So next, please. I was born in a remote part of the British Empire on the border of Burma in Assam. And so I started life half as a relic of an old British imperial system on the right in the picture, and half as a little Indian boy like Kipling's Mowgli. My best friend on the left was an Indian, and I spoke the local language. So I started off right at the edge of Britishness. Next, please. Next. So I came to England when I was 5.
Okay, yes. Sorry to bother you, darling.
And then I started to learn about Englishness. But this was 1947, the year of austerity after the war and very cold. And the next shock and really immersive training in Englishness was when I went to a boarding school. Next, please. This is the Dragon School in North Oxford, an elite British school. Me on the right, in the middle row there, in my last year playing rugby for the school. And there's no more intense way of learning English humour, culture, customs, than being immersed for 8 months of the year with a pack of other upper middle class boys. So that was the first stage of the shock of being English. And I then went on to another very quintessential British school. Next, please. I went to Sedber School, which is a very hardy, tough Yorkshire school, slightly old-fashioned at the time. It still believed that the British Empire was alive and that we were being trained through the system of authority, prefects and fags, and learning to rule and conquer the world. But I was also learning this in my home area because I was living in Esthwaite-Dale, which is where William Wordsworth went to school and was educated and wrote his famous prelude about that period. So this was very quintessentially English in the North as well. I then continued that because this is only a preparation. I then continued that when I went in 1960 to Oxford. Next, please. And by chance, having come from the beautiful Lake District, I went to what I think is the most beautiful college in Oxford, which is Worcester College. This is the famous Lake of Worcester. And here for 3 years as an undergraduate reading history, I learned about the manners and customs of the finishing school that is Oxford and Cambridge. And I had my first love affairs and everything. All this is documented in horrendous detail in these autobiographical books, which are based on my contemporary papers. I stayed there as an undergraduate, and then I stayed on for another 3 years. So I had 6 years in Oxford doing a postgraduate degree in English social history, the history of witchcraft. And then there was an interlude I'll talk about, and then I went on to my final home, academic home. Next, please. This is King's College, Cambridge. The room I was in when I came in 1971 is on the second floor of the White Building, the Gibbs Building, 4 windows from the left, H3, where Wittgenstein and the poker occurred and so on. And this was a great shock. I mean, Oxford and Cambridge are similar, but I'd been at the LSE in the intervening 2 years, a city university. So coming back to this was quite strange, but absolutely marvelous. And I've been in King's since then for the last 50 years. Next, please. And I've spent a lot of time exploring the university. I've written 5 or 6 books about Cambridge. 3 or 4 of them are very small, 2 longer ones, and they're all on my website if you're interested in any of them. I'll talk about a little more. All this made me swim in Englishness, but I also needed to be pushed away from this. And so I first had this through the European continent. Next, please. I traveled obviously to France, Italy, and Spain, and so on and so on. And I began to read seriously French, particularly French observers who are the best on the English as their neighbors. And I was particularly enamored of Alexis de Tocqueville and also Montesquieu, who are represented in 2 of the little books I wrote about history. And so it was from the French that I learned about the English to a considerable extent. But I also needed to get right outside Europe because there is a cousinly relationship. So I then went, next please, to do an anthropology PhD in Nepal, in the Annapurna Mountains in central Nepal, among tribal people called the Gurungs, who are the recruits into the British Gurkhas. And this is the house I lived in for 15 months. And that shock of completely different religion, society, economy, and so on, really put my own world looking back on Cambridge and England into perspective. Next, please. And I wrote a book about that experience. I also, next please, did a long study on headhunting people on the borders of Burma and India, where I'd been born, the Nagas. And that gave me another perspective on, from a long distance, of the English. Next, please. From 1990, I started to go to Japan. And if you can imagine how different that is, Japan is actually quite similar in social structure and certain features, but its culture and aesthetics and sense of identity is totally, totally different. So that gave me another shock. And I wrote this book about Japan through the looking glass. Next, please. I then, from 1996, started to go to China, and I've been 17 times to China. and understanding the Chinese in this format, a personal A to Z, is what I've tried to do with the English later on. And here, there are some overlaps with the English in the Chinese, but you can imagine how very different it is. And this sort of backwards and forwards between Cambridge and the Far East, or East Asia, constantly made me aware of how peculiar my own world was. So I now had the incentive to understand the English, but how was I going to do it? So basically, what I did, one approach, was to write lots of books about the English. Next, please. I wrote little books about how to understand ourselves and how to discover the world and so on and so on. Next, please. But the serious books were a series of monographs. The first, my MPhil on witchcraft. So the English witchcraft, what was that like and how was it different from Scottish and French and so on. Next, please. The family system of England, the family life of a 17th century clergyman, which was very similar to my own, it turned out, but very different from those I'd experienced elsewhere. Next, please. And my most influential book, which is a sort of the birth of this talk, The Origins of English Individualism, in both senses, why the English are different and why they're very individualistic. And that caused a great deal of controversy at the time because it attacked Marx and Weber and so on. Next, please. And then what is most quintessentially English, as I'll mention, is its legal system. So I did a study of it in operation, looking at a set of highway robbers and burglars in the north of England in the 17th century, and wrote a book similar to the work of, in some ways, modeled on Leroy-Laduerry's Montaigne or other books on French social history. They were very good at this kind of history. Next, please. And of course, the marriage system and the love system of England, which I'd written about on and off since my LSE days when I did a master's on this. And it overlaps a little bit with France, but it's pretty different in many ways, our marriage system. Next, please. And this is a long book comparing England and Japan in its medical and demographic features, things like toilets and food and famine and disease and so on are explored in this way. Next, please. And I tried to summarize all this for my granddaughter, who's sitting here beside me. It was written for her when she was this age, though I imagine she was about 17, and it's called Letters to Lily. It's my most popular book. And it's 30 letters to a granddaughter about how the world works. Things like love and the family and terrorism and so on and so on and so on. So this was a synthesis at the age of about 60 of what I discovered about the English as advice to a granddaughter. Next, please. And as I mentioned, I wrote a number of books. This isn't all of them. One, Reflections on Cambridge, which is a long anthropological historical overview of Cambridge. A couple on kings, one on the Department of Social Anthropology and another which isn't there about the city and the colleges. So Cambridge as an institution, as a very English institution, fascinated me. And as I was living there for many years, I thought it would be nice to summarize it all. Next, please. And then I synthesized all this together. I was asked to give a series of lectures in China about whatever I liked. So I chose The Invention of the Modern World, which is basically a summary of the Englishness and how we got to be where we are. Next, please. Another way of approaching trying to understand the Englishness was this autobiography. And here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's one more. 8 volumes based on the fact that I never threw any paper away from about the age of 14. So this is about twice the length of À la recherche de la temps perdu, and is based on actual documents and photographs and so on, not on memory. So all these are free as a downloads if you want to have a look at the PDFs. So this takes me finally to the peculiarity of the English. Next, please. As I said, I tried, how do you capture this? Well, it's impossible, because as David Hume, the philosopher, said, and summarized it, hence the English of any people in the universe have the least of a national character, unless this very singularity may pass for such. The English don't have a national character. They're a hodgepodge, as Daniel Defoe and many others pointed out. They've been swept over by numerous different traditions, cultures, whatever in its long history, and then most recently by the influx of its empire. So you can't sort of write a book about the English. You can watch the English, as Kate Fox did, and write an ethnography of certain features like queuing or drink behavior and so on. But you can't really write a book of the English. So what I did was to take a number of things which I thought were interesting about the English and write it as an encyclopedia, as it were. So if you look at this, you'll see just how I started off. Amateurs, the amateurism, which is famous of the English. Antiquities, their love of the past and preserving things. Aplomb, their supposed distinctive ability to survive all sorts of shocks with an urbane, stiff upper lip attitude. Barter, the fact that they don't actually barter much or haggle in the way that most cultures do. Beef, les roast beef, as they are known, as you will know. Their love of beer and beer culture. Brexit. In each case, I just wrote one sort of page or so, a little more. And in the Brexit one, I tried to explain why we left. I didn't want to leave and I was against it, but there were reasons behind it, which are a bit puzzling, but I tried to explain. Bribery, the English form of bribery, which is very sort of muted, but obviously there, and so on. The class system, cleanliness, clubs, crime, happiness, history, hobbies. Anyway, that is the book that Fabian has very kindly translated and we'll be talking about the translation of shortly. And it's just a very short book, trying to capture some of the quintessence. It's only my second book published in France. The first was about Japan. And I'm very glad to have a second book because I never thought this would happen. But what I'd like to end by talking about is when I wrote it, I thought I hadn't captured everything here. So I wrote a second part called The Peculiarity of the English. And a close friend of mine said, Alan, these are two different books. So I split them. And this one hasn't been translated. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that if you can move on to that. So this is the peculiarity of the English. Some of you, if you were historians, may have come across an article written by the Marxist historian Edward Thompson, E.P. Thompson, the Making of the Working Class historian. He wrote an article called The Peculiarity of the English. It wasn't about this sort of stuff. It was about how we didn't fit into the Marxist story at all. And it was an attack on more severe Marxist historians and saying we were different. Our pattern of our history didn't conform to the Marxist pattern. But I took this title and used it. And first of all, I write about how I discovered it and some features, what it is. And then for some odd reason, it's been missed out on this front page, but the first section was on law, what our legal system is, because one of the main reasons we left in Brexit was that English common law is the basis for our civilization. Our legal system is the fundamental building block of our society. And our customary legal system is totally different from the traditional Roman law French system. And so our procedures and so on, they've merged, of course, recently, but there is still a lot of difference. And so I write about, and I've done a lot of work on law, so I write about that. I then write about politics, democracy. And here, the main thing to say is that many people, when they talk about democracy, they mean elective representative governments, the British parliamentary system, the mother of all parliaments, all that stuff. I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about what Tocqueville meant by democracy when he wrote Democracy in America. He understood that democracy is not about ballots and putting your vote in, because that is very flawed and inadequate. What he is talking about is self-government, self-rule, how you actually feel that you are participating in your fate. In other words, what some people call civil society, where you belong to organizations which control your own life. And this is what he admired in America, this huge associational culture of America, which they'd taken from Britain and imported and successfully developed. So that is something which is very quintessentially, I don't know if you know, but until the later 19th century in France, you weren't allowed to hold a meeting, a public meeting of more than 12 people without government permission. Well, we British felt that clubs and meetings and demonstrations were our right, and that clubism and all that stuff is very important. The next section is on the family. And here I talk about the individualistic English family. What I think is most characteristic, you may think, some of you, that the French and the English family systems are pretty similar, but from my experience of my French friends and colleagues, it is still very different. Ours is based on, we are very unfamily-like. As soon as you grow up, you move away. I hardly see any of my relatives or think about them much. From about the age of 12, historically, from medieval times onwards in my researches, it's clear that the English sent their children away from home. It was regarded as very heartless by Italian visitors and so on. And they set up their own lives. They became apprentices or servants or whatever it was. And from then on, they were separated from their parents. Their parents had very little say in their lives. And this is our system. It's very, very individualistic. The important people in your life are your colleagues, your friends, and others. So this extraordinary individualistic family system is part of what I call the Anglosphere, or James Bonnet, my friend, just invented the term the Anglosphere. It's part of what was spread to America and has spread to Australia and so on. The next is class. And here, what is most distinctive, and again, I come back to Tocqueville. Tocqueville said that when the medieval system in England dissolved, it didn't, as it did in France, turn to caste. That is, blood-based, birth-based social divisions, where peasants are peasants and nobility are nobility, and so on and so on. In England, it moved to class. That is to say, you have many, many divisions, of course, very stratified, but very permeable. As he said, you can marry up and down, there are no marriage prohibitions. And if you are lucky and successful, if you make money, then you move up in class. So My Fair Lady, the George Bernard Shaw's book, is based on this idea. If you change your accent, if you are sent to a good boarding school like me, you change your accent, you learn the middle class habits, and you make enough money, then you become middle class. If you don't do those things, you stay where you are. So this fluid class system is very extraordinary. You don't find it really anywhere else in the world. The next is games. You don't need to be told that while the English are useless at games and haven't won a single medal in the Winter Olympics so far, we used to be good at these things. And indeed, most of the football that is shown on television is English football because we have lots of clubs. And by chance, we did discover the two main religions of the world, which are cricket and football. This is related to all sorts of things which I go into, but basically we are a games-loving country, and half my life, my thought, my energy at my boarding schools was playing games. That's why I showed you a photograph of me as a rugby player. Arts are, the main point I make here is that the English aren't great at art. They're not as good, nearly as good painters, obviously, as the French. Their music is not as good as the French or the Germans and so on. Architecture, except for the King's College Chapel in the Perpendicular period and a bit in the 18th century, we're not good at those things. What we are good at is literature, and in particular two that interest me. One is children's stories. About 3/4 of the greatest children's story writers in the West, anyway, are English or Scottish or Irish. So you don't need to, have Beatrix Potter and Peter Pan and all these things up to Harry Potter recited to you. But anyway, for one reason or another, we're great children's story writers. And the other thing is we're great poets. Cambridge, I discovered when I came here, 3/4 of the greatest poets in the English language were at Cambridge, not at Oxford, where I thought they were. And we treasure poetry, and it's a great English obsession, and I learnt a lot of it when I was at school. The economy, well, I don't need to rehearse this. Weber and Marx agreed that England was the root of capitalism, modern capitalism. Of course, people have always been capitalist in one sense, and places like Venice and Florence and so on were much more trades cities than England. But this special ethic, the spirit of capitalism that Weber talks about is very English. And this has been a thing I've studied for a long time. Religion, Puritanism. A fact some of you may not know is that Puritanism and Protestantism were invented in Cambridge. If you know Cambridge, which I hope some of you do, if you go to the corner of King's College, you'll see a blue plaque, and it says, this is where the White Horse pub, which was known as Little Germany in the early 16th century, where the people who were later burnt in Oxford, Whitgift and so on, they met and read Luther's works to each other. And the first Protestant sermon was preached from there in Little St. Edward's Passage church. And so the Bibles were sneaked up the riverways, and that's why they got to Cambridge and not to Oxford, these German works. So, and this, of course, has shaped English culture. We are a very Puritan, in many ways, infused civilization. Education, the main point I make here, and comes out of all my autobiography, is that education, as I was taught, was not for the mind. In France, it's very much mentally centered. You're training your mind, your memory, your logic, and so on. English education is about, at least in the schools I went to, is about the mind, the body, the spirit, and the heart. How to think, feel, act, as well as to think. So it's a very rounded sort of education. And then humor, irony. I don't need to tell you the fact that the English have a notorious sense of ironic humor, and they also have a sense of crazy humor, the sort of Monty Python's Flying Circus and the Goons and so on. So English humor is very peculiar to anyone, including the Americans to a certain extent, although P.J. O'Rourke, who died yesterday or today, had some of that satirical humor. And finally, the empire. Well, you can't understand the English without realizing that for 2 centuries they had the largest empire in history in terms of population. And not only did they take their law and all the rest of it over there, but these places brought their culture back. So many English words, many English customs, food, and so on have swept back into England. So we are a hodgepodge of our empire. And then I try at the end to explain how it happened. My brief theory of the effects of being an island cut off or shut off from Europe. So next, please. This attempt to understand Englishness is part of an attempt to understand and compare and form a bridge between different civilizations. So I wrote a book about the 4 civilizations I know something about: China, Japan, Europe, and the Anglosphere. Europe is the blue, which, as you see, includes South America and a bit of Russia for my purposes. And the light blue is the Anglosphere. And so this is trying to do, again, what Tocqueville did, which is to get at the quintessence of civilizations. And I've written several books of that kind. Next, please. And then we come back to Cambridge. This is the longer book on Cambridge, published by a press which I run in Cambridge, Cam Rivers Publishing. And it's based on the fact that my longest field work as an anthropologist is in Cambridge. For some reason, it's gone away. But if you'd, can we go back, Tony? Some reason you have lost my beautiful pictures of Cambridge. If it's impossible, don't worry. But
somebody was trying to tell me to move off preventers mode, which I did, and then it made it jump somewhere, so I don't know.
If you can go, yes, there's that, there we are. That's the one.
That's the one.
So here is the final picture. This is the back of the Gibbs building. And in an evening, often I stroll out through that archway onto the great lawn behind, look back as the sun is setting. And the whole of those windows, these 18th century windows, are a gold leaf. It's an absolutely magical sight. And I recite to myself a line from Shakespeare. The barge she sat in was of burnished gold that burned upon the water. So the burnished gold of kings. I'm a life fellow, so I will have the right to be buried in the chapel here. And so one day in future years, come and knock on the floor of King's College Chapel and say, "Hi, Alan." Anyway, over to Fabian, who will explain how she tried to translate one of my works. Thank you very much. Okay, Tony?
Yep. Fabian will need to unmute.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Beautiful. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to actually read a little bit of what I've been thinking when I was translating this piece of work. So my talk is divided in 2 parts. The first part is how it all began, the processes, and then the challenges. So how it began? Well, quite simply, out of proofreading a good many of Alan's books. There was one especially that I liked, which he sent to me by email, called Understanding the English, a Personal A to Z, published in 2019. So if you can show the slide 26 again, so you can actually see the book in English. If you can't, doesn't matter. By that time, I had also become familiar with the figure of l'homme du terroir, who was a stranger in his own country, an étranger autochtone, of whom we've just heard in the first part of Alan's presentation. In 2016, I moved back to France myself, having lived in England for over 40 years, 30 of them in Cambridge, using English as my first language and working on French literature. But by the time I'd started on proofreading the volume in 2018, my own position as an outsider from inside had become more clearly defined. Although I was a femme du terroir, I was now also a stranger in my own land. However, I had the pleasure of revisiting England through reading Alan's books from the viewpoint of someone who had lived and was at home wherever, but primarily, of course, in Cambridge. First at King's for 4 years, and then as an itinerant supervisor for the English faculty, and afterwards becoming a by-fellow and tutor chaplain at Homerton College in 2011 for 5 years. So as my work on proofreading, the A to Z, progressed, I used to send Alan my comments, for example, on decency and the sea and clique. And I reported that flashers in France are as numerous as wasps. And to my great pleasure and utter surprise, one day Alan proposed that we include some of these notes at the end of his English volume. Altogether, today I can count 10 out of 34 that are mine, 11 if we count the note on etiquette. But I can see now that sometimes my information seems strangely out of date. For example, flashers for the note on decency, or a TV personality called Steed in Chapeau melon et bottes de cuir for the entry on aplomb. Chapeau melon et bottes de cuir, The Avengers, dates back to the late 60s, 4 years before I left France. But I certainly saw no flashers in 2018 when I was doing the proofreading, and I'd already been living in France again for 2 years. But what this backdating suggests is that while I was reading through the typescript about England as an old civilization, delving into the English love of antiquities and personal archives and the origin of pubs and international time, I was thinking of one main thread running through the book. Its concern with the root causes of many of the features destined to define the national character. It occurs to me now that several of those features described as traditionally English, like the honesty box, were already aspects of England I had also found enchanting as a child. In my school textbook in particular, there was a picture of bottles of milk left on a London doorstep and children with top hats in public schools. As I read on, I also had my memories of cycling out of Cambridge to Coton, where I would find apples sitting in a bag next to a little box, or those evenings when I left my room in Gibbs, H6, and saw the King's School choristers arriving for their rehearsal before evensong. No matter how distorting of reality memories can be, there seemed to be a connection of the past with the present between the two cultures, thanks to the linguistic systems which I hadn't realized was there before. This made me think it would be possible to render this book into French. This realization became very obvious from the choice I made for the title. Understanding the English, something not even Montesquieu could achieve, was made possible by writing from a personal view of them in the style of an A to Z. The alphabetical and orderly listing on the green book cover, which you have just seen on Alan's PowerPoint, was repeated in large, bold character at the beginning of each section for the corresponding words in alphabetical order. That detail is missing in my translation. I was supposed to paint a large picture unifying pieces that were often paradoxical, like pieces of stained glass or a puzzle put together. For the French edition, I decided to choose the White Cliffs of Dover from an original painting by Richard Andrews, and for me, another locus of memory, un lieu de mémoire, drawing out the idea that the English are unknowable, unpredictable, and insular, as they are and were known to be on the continent long before the days of the Eurostar. As for the title, the preposition jusqu'à, les Anglais de A jusqu'à Z, to convey the paradox made visible by the meaning of the picture, namely that this unknowability was going to be unveiled, disclosed, exposed, through and through, de part en part. Furthermore, taking my cue from the intention in the text to let go of the academic style and present the facts in the manner of a guidebook. This is one of the qualities of Alan's writing, which I like so much. My aim was to make the unifying picture containing the paradoxes apparent. By analogy, if you like, with a stained glass window presenting the same subject over several panes, as in the late Gothic style of King's Chapel. By transposition to the language, this meant that one word, one concept might be carried over several entries and add therefore different hue to the entry in question. But this was my main challenge. For the multiplicity of meanings that I might find in one word, I will choose the example of the word gentleman, which appears as an entry untranslated in my French. But for now, I will show you how a phrase can reappear in a context and fail to capture its complete meaning. So now the challenge is, I shan't comment much on the fact that mad dogs, this is just a small parenthesis, mad dogs in the saying, mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. Dogs are probably not en proie à la folie, as I wrote, but rather enragés. Seuls les chiens enragés et les Anglais sortent en plein midi. More importantly, when the author says that after arriving in England from India and starting prep school, he had, and I quote, to learn how to be properly English, end of quote. Was it right of me to think that properly meant through and through, de part en part, and should therefore be translated, il a fallu que j'apprenne à devenir anglais de A jusqu'à Z. The phrase fails, with hindsight, to convey a nuance of appropriateness that is implicit in this properly. I had to become English as was fitting or appropriate to the context of the upper middle class. Properly, comme il se devait. Now for the word gentleman. In French, as in English, a gentleman is someone with a refined education. In Le Petit Robert, you can read un gentleman est un homme distingué d'une parfaite éducation. In the A to Z, we learn that there is no legal status attached, nor is it a question of nobility from birth. The author adds with a touch of wry humor, as he often does in that book, that the word is based entirely on how you behave, and the status of a gentleman lies in the eyes of the beholder. On the face of it, it would seem that the word need not be translated. In the same Petit Robert, you find that you can reach a gentleman's agreement, one that is not bound by law. And the words are left in English in French. And Allen himself writes on this notion that an Englishman's word is his bond. La parole de l'anglais vaut un contrat. The notion of being a gentleman being fully integrated here to that of Englishness. Yet in the French dictionary, we find that a professional thief is un gentleman cambrioleur, in sharp contrast to the image we've just conjured up about having a refined education. Therefore, even though you might think of a gentilhomme as antiquated in modern France, le bourgeois gentilhomme comes to mind, it might be the word we need for that entry. For in a literary sense, a gentilhomme is un homme qui montre de la noblesse, de la générosité dans ses actes, de la distinction dans ses manières. On parle de agir en gentilhomme. Someone who displays a nobility of character, a generosity in his actions, and is distinguished in manners, to act as a gentleman. There is a third occasion in the A to Z when, I quote, a true English gentleman is indeed supposed to be a gentle man, in 2 words, where the author uses gentle in a familial context when he says men have to treat their women as their equals and partners. Now, I chose the adjective doux here instead of gentil. The complication being here that the word gentil is a commonplace, and it would lessen that notion of equality as a defining feature of relationships based on companionships in A to Z, on which Allen is very keen. So I think I shall leave the last words to Virginia Woolf, who found in Thackeray this: what is it to be a gentleman? It is to be tender to women and chivalrous to servants. And what else? I cannot remember, though I used to know it by heart. So in conclusion, the overall point I'm making is that I think the 2 linguistic systems of French and English are not hermetically sealed, contrary to what we might believe when we say that words are untranslatable. And I put this thought to Alan yesterday in an email, and he replied in true Macfarlanean fashion, I agree. Things are more or less translatable, probabilistic, and on a continuum, not either translatable or not. Otherwise, we could not communicate. Thank you.
Thank you to Alan and Fabian. I'm sure we all found that very interesting. There aren't really any questions yet in the chat. I mean, there's a couple of comments which may go through, but there's not really questions. Now, does anybody have questions for our speakers? If you can raise your hand in some way. There is through the participants box, there's a way to do it. Is anybody, as we're way over 25, I don't see everybody on the screen at the same time. So.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just interested, Alan. You actually formed your own publishing company, and you publish your books through your company in Cambridge. What was the prime motivator in that? Did you start with publishing your own books, or did you start with publishing third-party books? And what is the mix between your own books and third-party books in your own publishing company?
Well, that's a very embarrassing question for an Englishman. It started actually, I work a lot with China, and I set it up with a young Chinese former student of mine. And it started originally to publish books about the work we were doing on transferring Chinese culture, that is music, art, poetry, and so on, to Cambridge and back. Some of you, if you come to Cambridge or have been to Cambridge, may see a large white stone on the back by the bridge at King's. I am the keeper of that stone, which is dedicated to the most famous Kingsman, perhaps along with Turing, who is a Chinese poet, Zhu Zhumou. And I helped to bring the stone there and make the garden round it. Now, we run the Zhu Zhumou Poetry and Arts Festival every year. We've done 7 of them now. The first 5 were real, and we published the catalogue and catalogues of the exhibitions, calligraphy and art and painting. And we needed to publish those. So we largely set it up for that reason. But as soon as it was set up, we continued to publish books published by, I should think about half our books are Chinese artists and poets and so on who are publishing in English. So that's about half of them. We've published 1 or 2 of English academics, for example, Christopher Prendergast, who some of you may know of as the leading expert on Proust, or one of the leading experts on Proust. We've published some of his work, and we've published the work of English artists and others. But, and here, if any of you are academics, particularly retired academics, when you retire from academic life, a strange thing happens, which is that the phone stops ringing. What I mean is that before, when you sent your publishing agent or a press the plan for a book of yours, or you sent a learned journal your article, they wrote back saying, "Oh, wonderful to have this, Alan. Of course, yes, we'll send it out." Now, as soon as I retired, the network is lost. You're no longer someone who has students and so on and so on. So they say, "We'll let you know." And it becomes very difficult, particularly with my kind of book, which lies exactly between serious, formal, hundreds of footnotes kind of academic books, which I used to write, and very popular books. So my books are neither trade nor academic. They're in the middle between the two. And so I could have probably found publishers, and I found publishers in India and elsewhere who were very happy to do this. But in Britain, Profile, who was my main publisher for a number of my books, stopped wanting to publish my books. That book on 4 civilizations, my agent died, and they suddenly said, "We're no longer interested in this unless you totally change it." So, in fact, a lot of my books are published through this because it takes away all the hassle. I'm one of the 2 people who decide whether to publish the book, and also they're all published in China. And a prophet is not known in his own country. My books, many of the books I publish are hardly read in the Western world, but they are bestsellers in China, some of them, because they are strange, they are magical realism. And so the publishing firm was set up for another purpose originally, but I have piggybacked on that and publish a lot of my stuff through them. Okay?
Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
There is a question here. What are the challenges of studying one's own society as opposed to foreign ones? Actually, there's some questions above that. Lawrence raised a hand.
Yeah. So
Lawrence,
Lawrence, would you like to unmute and explain your question?
Hello, that's me, Alan. Thank you very much. Actually, my question was the one that you read out. I remember studying anthropology with you very fondly, and of course, in ethnography, one is always confronted with a society, or traditionally a society, that is very different to one's own, and there are challenges of interpretation. I wonder how you feel studying your own society was different from ethnography in the traditional sense.
Thank you. That's a good question. Studying the ethnography of China or Nepal or something, you really don't have to go through the procedure of distancing yourself, because you are a stranger there and many things strike you as strange and interesting anyway. Adam Smith said the secret of discovery is wonder and surprise. And you find wonder and surprise when you go to Nepal or Japan. So it's sort of head on. When you come back, and particularly if you spend a bit of time in your own culture, it becomes over-familiar. And it's quite an effort to defamiliarize yourself from it. It also can be undermining. I won't go into any details, but one of my books on Cambridge, when I sent it to my college, there was quite a strong feeling that I'd let the show down. They didn't put it like that, of course, but basically in anthropology, you have a distinction between front stage, which is the presentation of your society to strangers, and the backstage, which is your own personal life. So I'd done the rather un-English thing of actually exposing a little bit of the inside family culture of my college. And that was, I mean, C.P. Snow, many novelists have done this, of course, Peter Porterhouse Blue and so on and so on. It's all right in a novel, but if it comes as a semi-serious academic book exposing what could be seen as weaknesses, you know, petty corruption or whatever it is, then you shouldn't do it. So that was one of the difficulties. It's like writing a book about your family in your own society. And therefore there are things you know you cannot say, even though an outsider. So in some ways it would be easier. I had a student from India who worked with me, and he studied witchcraft in the Fens in Cambridge. And he wrote a very interesting thing because he was Indian and he looked at it from the outside in a way which perhaps I wouldn't have seen. I wouldn't have seen much of it. So I think that's a few of the differences and difficulties. Okay. So I have Sandra has asked the next question. How much collaboration was there between Alan and Fabian on the translation? Well, I think Fabian, do you want to answer that?
Well, as I was saying to Alan, when I saw his PowerPoint and his notes, I'd already actually written most of my stuff. I was surprised how complimentary our talk was going to be tonight. It was really, I had no idea that, you know, we were writing in along the same lines, really. How much collaboration there was while I was translating the book. As I said, the proofreading actually was a lonely and lonesome exercise. I think I must have proofread about 25 books. And we didn't necessarily communicate. I just sort of was interested in reading, proofreading, and so forth. So I think altogether, I think we were friends. So basically, that's what the collaboration is about.
Yes, it's about friendship and learning about another culture, and it's all about friendship, as I've discovered when I work in various places. Lawrence, you asked the question, which is the next one here. And then Andrew, a personal note to Alan and Fabian to give an example of a peculiarity in the English or French which struck them and surprised them especially. I'll let Fabian think of what one. I'll add to that most recently. What recently has most surprised me in the last 2 weeks is the belligerence of the English. Coming from China, whose based system, it may push gradually over the world, but its policy is compromise, harmony, all this stuff, which isn't just rhetoric. And then listening to our foreign secretary, our prime minister, and others, the head of our Armed Services Committee and so on, Tom Tugendhat, the kind of bullying belligerence which I encountered when I was at school and was taught was not the way the English behave. They don't threaten and bad-mouth their enemies. They respect them and try and find out why they're disagreeing and so on. To find this at the highest levels of my own political system, and to find, frankly, as you all know, a prime minister who was educated through the elite of our system, and yet is completely not a gentleman. His sexual mores, his untrustworthiness, his deviousness is absolutely the opposite of what I was taught to be a gentleman. Now, I didn't expect to find this. Most of our prime ministers, in one way or other, have been sort of gentlewomen or gentlemen, and many of our politicians. So either things have changed very rapidly or I've become more puritanical in my old age. I don't know, but that's my recent peculiarity of the English. It's what the French have often noticed about the English, that they're bullies. Fabian.
Do you think that applies to all the, obviously not to all the English, but do you think it is really an English characteristic, or is it just a subsection which happens to have got to the top of the political?
I hope. I mean, there's large pockets of it. I mean, the behavior of English football fans and so on is well known. But I think on the whole, moving around my village and moving around England, most of the people I meet are very gentle, considerate and kind. But something, whether it's those sorts of bullying thugs who get drawn to politics, or whether it's being in that position that turns them, but John Major and others never ended up like that. My uncle was a member of Parliament for Cambridge, and he Robert Rhodes James, and he was a gentleman, and you could trust his word, but I wouldn't trust the word of our political leaders at the moment at all. Fabian, you're all going to answer.
When I moved back in 2016, I had been riding a bicycle in Cambridge since 1987. And I decided in my native Auvergne that I would continue riding my bicycle. And I was regularly the subject of mockery by people. They couldn't, they really saw me as an eccentric, you know, in this sort of world where there is the Michelin tire factory and all this culture about speed and all this. People saw me as really quite eccentric because obviously it's quite steep, you know, the hills are quite steep. And so I actually walk by my bicycle, and but the situation seems to have changed since COVID and the need to basically reconsider how we live and how much petrol we use and all that. So I think that's one feature, but I would say that altogether, the word thank you and sorry en français, on les entend peu en France, ces mots-là, whereas in England, there are, you know, all the time, people have always been polite. Voilà.
I think the French complain about the English saying thank you too much.
Oh.
Well, it's and there's a whole there's a book about why the English apologize so much, and I'm sure that Kate Fox has written about this probably. It's part of our confrontational culture, actually, because we're very confrontational and egalitarian. But this requires, if you make a false step or bump into someone or think you're in the wrong, you should apologize. This again is, I shouldn't be too political, but this is something which is being betrayed by our present Prime Minister, who finds it very difficult to apologize properly about anything. But I was taught, I'm not very good at it actually. My wife, if she was with me, would tell you that I'm a lousy apologizer because I'm always doing things wrong and refusing to apologize. But we were taught we should do that often. And thank you for everything.
Alan, can I ask you a question? Can you
Yes,
hear me?
I can see you.
Sorry.
Don't worry. Yes.
I can put it on its side, but I'd rather see you standing up. I was born English in Norfolk, and for about 30 years I've now have French nationality, and all my family is French.
Yeah.
Now, question: if you were able, hypothetically, to choose being born in an English family or in a French family in France, which one would you choose, hypothetically? And having chosen, could you explain why?
Okay, well, so at this point I lose all my viewers probably because, I mean, it's sort of balanced because there are many, many features which all of us are very attracted to about France, particularly in the south of France. The thought of being in a fairly stable middle-class family somewhere in the warm south of France, full of the warm south, as Keats talks about, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim and all that sort of, it's very attractive, particularly in the middle of a gale in England. Even if the French turn themselves upside down and talk to you, as is happening at the moment, it's a very attractive thing. On the other hand, I'm very, the oddness of being an anthropologist is that you admire, try to understand, and have many deep friends in other cultures. But something about indoctrination or something means that you are deeply attached to your own. So I can be hypercritical about the British, as I just have been about our politicians, and about many features of British culture. I'm a Scotsman, of course, and that helps. I'm 5/8 Scots. But in the end, I feel very proud and happy about many things British, and can go on at length about how the British have done very many good things and their empire was the least worst empire, and so on and so on. So I certainly, from my own experience, as I say, our family system is absolutely minimal, but the compensation for that is our marriage system can be very, very strong. And I have a wonderful wife of 50 years, and that has given me a great deal of what is worthwhile in my life. And I might not have had that if I'd had to share it in a different way with the family systems in some parts of France that I know. I live in the fens near Cambridge, which are very beautiful, though I prefer mountains and lakes and rivers. So I think the best thing would be to spend 6 months in England and 6 months in France, and then get the best of both worlds. But at the moment, that is not possible. So to my upside down friend in France, maybe see you one day. How you've moved sideways, that's great. Next.
Sandra asked if we could see the cover to the French version, which was on the invitation. So I can show that on the screen.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe Richard can comment it.
Yeah.
Yes, this was painted by Richard Andrews down on the left-hand side. Very lovely cover. But as Fabian says, this sort of shows one thing I sort of would like to add a footnote to, she said that it shows the insularity. Mm. I've just been writing a paper to celebrate the relationship between China and the British of 70 years when we set up diplomatic relations. And one of the things I think we have in common is non-insularity. We are extremely insular in that we protect all these things, like our legal system, language, and so on. So there's this kind of boundary around us with white cliffs. But we are incredibly cosmopolitan. And this is the result largely of our imperial period. That is to say, if you look at my own personal ancestors, most of them spent most of their life in Burma, China, India, Mexico, Australia, whatever. Our cities are extraordinary examples of cosmopolitan success. I mean, we have our tensions and institutional racism, but it's a miracle if you travel through many British cities, how well people from many different cultures are getting on together, it seems to me as an outsider. And of course, Cambridge is a quintessence of this, because nearly 3/4 of my students in Cambridge were either from Europe or from other parts of the world. And when I meet people, they are from all over the world. So England is a very cosmopolitan society. And China is also, for other reasons, it's so huge, so diverse, it's been flowed over by so many conquerors, that when Chinese go abroad, they are like the English. The English settle anywhere, make some money, and then come back because their roots are English, which is what I talk about. Chinese are the same. They have a huge diaspora, but they are still Chinese. And it's this combination of insularity, strong identity, and roving cosmopolitanism, which is one of the odd features, I think, of the English. The French, as you know, have an entirely different imperial system, an entirely different attitude, which is why they're in big trouble at the moment with Muslim and others, which is that basically, and you don't need a lesson on this, but basically the French system is based on cultural assimilation, so that if you by chance get Vietnam, shall we say, or Algeria or Morocco, what you do is you treat them as equals. That is, they can have French passports, they can come back, they can run for president, as one of them is doing at the moment, Algerian, but on the condition they are French. What does that mean? They have to speak French, they have to read French, they have to eat French, they have to behave by the culture of French. As a result, they're much more relaxed. There's much more marriage between, and often they settle there because they feel at home. The British don't settle in that way except in Virgin territories, and they retain rigidly their British culture, as my parents did as tea planters. You know, they keep their distance. On the other hand, they don't expect the people in their empire to become British. They don't force them. My supervisor, Ernest Gellner, or not supervisor, my mentor, Ernest Gellner, the philosopher who worked in Morocco, starts one of his chapters of general essays saying, at 9 o'clock, everywhere in the French Empire, every child from anywhere from Morocco to Vietnam would start the first lesson at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. Nos ancêtres, les Gauls. Our ancestors, the Gauls, because they were their ancestors, they'd become French. And this is a big difference. Anyway, I'm rambling on, but that's insular but cosmopolitan.
Are there any other comments or questions? Kate.
Well, there's one more from Lawrence Deering. Should we just do that one?
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain why the English, inverted commas, provides a meaningful level of cultural analysis rather than a more narrow category based on local, regional, or class culture? This is from an anthropologist, obviously. It's not one or the other. I mean, I could write books about the English lower middle class or upper middle class. I could write about the Cambridgeshire Fens. I have written those sorts of books about particular aspects of English locally. But what's happened in my life, which I'll share with you, is that gradually through my life, my sort of attempt to understand has broadened out. I started writing doctoral theses on one village in the Annapurnas. I would never generalize about Nepal or even these people and in England, one English county in witchcraft. And then I wrote about the English between A and B. And then gradually, when I worked in Japan and China and so on. So I often liken it to my boarding school where we had high mountains behind us in the Yorkshire moors. And we used to climb up them on a sunny day with the clouds below. And early in my academic life, I climbed up and looked down and I saw a little bit of the landscape below me. Later in my 50s and 60s, with experience and traveling further, I was higher up this mountain, looking out. And my now my unit of analysis, which is not the perfect one, and there are many others, is a civilization. I write about civilizations. And so that's why one of my books is about 4 civilizations. It's not the English, it's the Anglosphere. The Anglosphere is England, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that sort of. That is a cultural region where many of the fundamental are similar. The Eurosphere is the continent in South America and Western Russia. The Sinosphere is China, Korea, South Korea a bit, and so on and so on. So I find thinking at this level, and it's partly also events, it's not just that I've grown older, in living in this global world where we are trying to understand big shifts, tectonic shifts in power between civilizations, I think I need to talk about things rather like Huntington talks about in The Clash of Civilizations. Because if we don't think about at that level, we will all destroy each other. We need to understand other civilizations. And my striving as an anthropologist and historian has to move up. And the greatest writer on civilizations was de Tocqueville. His portrait of America, and to a certain extent of England and then of France, is a portrait of 3 civilizations. And many of my methods are taken from Tocqueville's because he somehow got above the whole thing. There's no other person except for Max Weber who is of that quality, Montesquieu to a certain extent, but those are the great civilizational writers who I've written books about and I admire, and I try to do the same thing. Okay.
So
Tony, may I come in and make a comment?
Yeah, well, as Kate Fox was going to say something, then if you can wrap up, that would be great.
Okay, right.
Kate?
Oh, it's just a question. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, Kate, of course.
Just a question. You said right at the beginning of your talk that the English have no national character.
Yeah.
I've always understood the term national character to be a kind of colloquial way of talking about culture, in the sense of socially transmitted information capable of affecting behavior, whatever you want to call culture. I just wondered if, and obviously you do believe that the English do have a national culture. So I just wondered if you had a different understanding of the term national character.
I was just seeing whether I could find the full David Hume quote. I don't mean a culture that's transmitted. What I mean is, if you said to the English, what unites you? What unites a person living in Devon with someone living in Yorkshire or Northumberland with someone, and so on? Shall we say, a Muslim living in Bradford and a stockbroker living in Kent. What is there? that is uniting them in any way whatsoever. They're not united by religion. They may not be united by language. They're certainly not united by life experience, by interest, desire, anything. What makes them English in some united way? And I think this is probably what David Hume was meaning. And I've always assumed that from time to time, Brexiteers like Johnson and so on, and Priti Patel and others, tried to think that we should, when people come to this country, they should become English. And they're sent for classes in Englishness. And they're a complete waste of time and flop, because what does that mean? That means answering a few questions on Shakespeare, asking whether you like fish and chips, singing a verse from Rule Britannia. Do you play, I mean, the Tebbit test, do you support an English football team against an Indian one? That is Englishness. That's as far as you can get. It's meaningless. And it's interesting because this is the same in China. There's really nothing uniform to unite people except the language, the written Mandarin and spoken Mandarin language, and an imperial political system. Otherwise, if you say what's in common between someone in northwest China and old Manchuria and someone down in Yunnan, it's nothing. Food, nothing. But they say we are part of China. And a Bradford Muslim will say we are English. And when it comes to a war, they'll fight for them, which is the strange thing after all that. So to be continued, our discussion, Kate, about that. And thank you for coming. I learned a great deal. Kate was one of my students many years ago. And of course, she's superseded her teacher and has become a friend of mine, which has healed the wounds of going to Cambridge railway station every few weeks and going to London in the 1980s or 90s and seeing #1 bestseller, Kate Fox. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, well, Tony, we should probably wrap it up pretty soon. Alan, I have a comment to make. I'm a scientist by trade, and I spent half my working life in England and the second half running a scientific institute in France. The difference between the way in which one does science in France and on the continent, in France particularly, is very, very sharp.
Yeah.
In England, the Baconian tradition is one has a problem, one looks at the problem, and you start to throw solutions at it and see which sort of solution is the one that's most likely to work.
Yeah.
In France, the Cartesian tradition, you don't do that. You don't start thinking of solutions. You must first analyze the problem. And so the French will think that the British way of doing science is not serious, whereas the British think that the French way of doing science is ineffective. And it shows in the sense that there are many, many more Nobel Prizes in experimental physics in England than in France, because you don't get a Nobel Prize by trying to understand the problem, which you don't understand in the first place. You want to get a Nobel Prize by thinking of a solution that completely comes out of the air. So this is one of the differences between France and English way of doing science and the French way. Having said that, I think we really must draw this to a close. So Alan and Fabian, thank you very much. This has been the most fascinating discussion, and we go away with lots of ideas which we will think about when we turn off the screen. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you both.
Thank you.